District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Nick, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's good to have you on.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate you having me on the program.
Where did the catalyst to cover energy and natural resources issues come from? Do you have some sort of connection to these issues? What made you interested in writing about this for the Daily Caller? Coming into it, I had no particular interest per se. Pay attention to it and curious about the world and so forth. But it was something that I was more assigned to me actually when I started writing for the Daily Caller News Foundation, and I've sincerely enjoyed it. I think it's fascinating stuff. It's the energy space in general is incredibly important. Energy policy, all the nonprofits, environment and conservation. You have the whole sort of private sector and corporate aspect of things. It's a key domestic issue, but also a key international issue, as we've seen time and time again. So all of these things together, I think, make the very broad subject quite interesting to me. And, I think it's, in many respects, it's something that doesn't get as much attention as it sometimes should, especially sort of in the moment that we find ourselves in now, both domestically and on the global scale. So this curiosity to cover kind of these ignored issues as it relates to energy, natural resources, conservation led you to do a deep dive into the Klamath River dam breaching that has been going on, and it's kind of unfolding right now. I don't know if they're in the final stages, but for my listeners who are unaware with what's happening in the Klamath River, could you give them some context and what the status of that breaching of the dam is there?
Sure. So geographically, the Klamath River is about 260 miles long, all sorts of tributaries and so forth, but it's located in Northern California and also in Southern Oregon. So it's kind of the region of the country we're talking about here. And in terms of dam removal, what's going on there? So the river, for a long time, almost a century, has had this system of 4 dams, incrementally along the river. Those dams are used to generate hydroelectric power. And so those dams are aging. As I said, they've been there for many decades, and there's increasingly a push, and this push has been alive for some time, but the environmentalist left generally, as regards the specific river, wants to get rid of the dams to restore the Klamath River to this sort of free-flowing cold water river, which they say will ultimately benefit the salmon populations that are native to that river system. So again, there's 4 dams and reservoirs behind those dams, and all sorts of other, smaller pieces of infrastructure that are part of the system. But this has been an issue that, this has been a fight, I guess you can call it, that's been going on for a number of years now. And only recently, in the last 6 to 12 months, have the dams actually started to come down. And that's a multifaceted process and more complicated than you might expect. And it takes time to do, but right now we're sort of in the middle of the dam removal. It would appear as though there's not much that can be done to stop that at this point. The ship has kind of sailed, but there's this movement on the environmental left, especially across the United States, not just in the Klamath River region, to
get rid of dams, and especially dams that are used for hydroelectric power, because they're perceived to be detrimental to wildlife and so forth in those rivers across the United States. This Klamath River Dam started really the process of actually removing it started in late 2023, but it's, as I said, ongoing currently. So what happened here, kind of broad strokes, is that they started, and from what Congressman LaMalfa has told me, as well as what you read about local sort of environmental and conservation officials in the region and so forth, it seems as though the removal has to date not been executed flawlessly. Let's put it that way. There are several issues that have sort of come downstream of this, no pun intended. One of them being, the release of salmon fry is what they're called. Those are basically very young salmon, only 5 to 10 weeks old or so, from a hatchery that's located along the river. This hatchery it's expensive. It's pretty state of the art. It's a pretty state of the art facility. And the idea is that once the dams come down and this river, is restored to a free flowing cold river, that hatchery will be sort of the spawn point to really release salmon into the river and boost the salmon population there. So that's sort of the background that we're working with here. And one of the things that's happened, the actual mass deaths of many of these salmon fry, that's sort of the focus of my piece. This happened in very late February and early March. But even in January, you can find these pictures on the internet. They're quite striking, but effectively they are starting to bring down the reservoirs behind the dams as part of this process. And it's been reported by other outlets that work crews effectively didn't have enough time to go into these sort of brought down reservoirs and blast away all of this sort of silt and gunk and whatever you want to call it that is accumulated at the bottom of the reservoirs. So as a result, you sort of have these scenes. They look somewhat apocalyptic of, expanses of mud and kind of yucky mud where these reservoirs used to be. And the river hasn't really fully taken its shape back yet. It seems to be on its way. But as a result of this, you have parts of the river that are extremely high concentrations of silt, or at least did at the time. This is 4 to 6 weeks ago at this point. So you'll see pictures of one branch of the river system intersecting with another, and it almost looks like olive oil and vinegar, mixing together, because the turbidity of the water from both of those little tributaries is so vastly different. So part of what's happened with this mud, before we get to the death of the salmon, is that number one, it stinks. You have kind of dead fish stuck in this mud, and I'm sure your listeners are well aware that that's not a very pleasant smell. And there are plenty of people that live in and around this river system. Additionally, you've also seen an actual change to the physical river that many locals who have, particularly who had waterfront properties along this the river as it used to be, they've seen their circumstances change drastically. What used to be sort of this prime waterfront real estate is no longer, and that comes with plenty of potential financial difficulties for those property owners as well. I've heard stories of basically of deer getting stuck in this mud, and it's so thick, and the animal is basically stuck in it like it's wet cement. And so local kind of wildlife officials had no choice apparently but to basically put the deer down, and I believe it was also accompanied by its offspring by shooting it from a distance. So there are plenty of sort of second order effects here that have manifested and may well continue to as this process proceeds in the coming months and maybe even years. And And so, these are the sorts of trade-offs or outcomes that are not necessarily as widely or loudly marketed by, the folks who are pushing hard for dam removal in the Klamath and who have pushed for it to date.
And Nick is taking this from his really great report on this really sordid subject. The river is essentially dead, how Enviros pushed to save salmon ended up killing hundreds of thousands of them. And I'm looking for through your report, scanning it over again. And I think the numbers you put out initially or currently as of the writing and as we're speaking is almost 850,000 young salmon have passed away, have died.
So there were 830,000 salmon that were salmon fry.
Released.
Again, those sort of young, those young premature salmon, I guess you can call them. And those were released from the hatchery. So what state officials have said and what they told me, California state officials, that is that these fry, they were released. And because of, the sort of the drawn down reservoirs and so forth, they effectively ventured through this tunnel, but as part of the dam infrastructure and system. And what happened to them is that they suffered, it's believed that they suffered from gas bubble disease, which is a good way to think of it is sort of like how humans get the bends. The gas bubble disease is an approximate equivalent for fish. And so anyways, the officials and stakeholders and so forth figured something was deeply wrong with these 830,000 fry that they had released from the hatchery, because thousands of them were washing up dead downstream. And so I suppose it's difficult to get an accurate estimate of, how many specifically died, but the number is almost certainly in the hundreds of thousands, if not, a very high percentage of those 830,000 that were released initially. So in my conversations with state officials and spokespeople for these relevant agencies, the premature deaths of these salmon were characterized to me as sort of a function of where the fish were released along the river. So going forward, the idea is that they will not replicate the mistakes that led to this tragic outcome. So it's something that caught these officials who do care about the salmon. It caught them off guard, evidently. And so, it was characterized to me in my discussions with these folks as a terrible and tragic outcome, but also one from which lessons can be learned. And so that's sort of the state of play with the salmon. We shall see. They're planning to release millions of these salmon fry from this hatchery in the future. So we shall see if hopefully this is an isolated incident and similar outcomes are not happening down the road. But that's effectively the state of play, and something that was conveyed to me not only by Congressman LaMalfa, but who represents the 1st District of California up there, northeastern California, but also people who work at conservationist think tanks in the Pacific Northwest. Their sort of take to me was that you don't really get to chalk things like this up to learning experiences when you're sort of supposed to be the experts and the technocrats, if you will, who are responsible for ensuring these types of outcomes specifically don't happen. So, I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt where it's due. And, I'm not necessarily an expert of conservation, certainly not any more than people that I, called up to write this story. But I think that in general, the story reflects a wider trend when we're talking about natural resources and energy and preserving nature, etc. Sometimes there are unexpected outcomes and trade-offs that in retrospect are in fact predictable. Maybe not when they happen necessarily, but pardon me. But I think that when we have these discussions, and they can be about any number of things, I think it's very important to keep in mind that if there was an awesome solution that made everyone happy and that worked perfectly, then, obviously everyone would be on board with that. Unfortunately, that's just not really the way of the world. And especially not when you're talking about complicated things, things that rely on a multitude of kind of interrelated factors like ecosystems, energy markets, you name it. So yeah, I think that this story is sort of a very good example of that. And, also sometimes that things that are marketed as, slam dunk climate or conservationist measures actually don't fully turn out to be quite the slam dunk that they're purported to be.
And you cite a group called American Rivers. I've heard this name before in terms of being some of the biggest propagators of hydroelectric dam removal with a mission to restore the free flow of rivers. And as a person who fly fishes, I'm kind of an unusual person where I have a more nuanced take on dams. I'm not wholly against dams like a lot of my fellow fly anglers. And I have those same reservations about whether or not dam removal is practical. And you talk about American Rivers, them being closely associated with the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, who is pushing this notion. And so what has been the response of American Rivers with this push that they were successful in undertaking and getting? Has there been any perhaps sense of regret or acknowledgement that maybe this plan is not conducive to restoring the salmon population there?
To my knowledge, no. And, I looked around pretty thoroughly before we went to press and, couldn't really find any sort of acknowledgement from American Rivers specifically of the deaths of the salmon. It's possible that they have subsequently, but an important distinction to make here as well is that American Rivers, as you alluded to, is a it's a national organization, and it's a very well funded one at that. For example, this is a group that since 2020, just a sort of a cursory review of their tax filings that we conducted, they've taken more than $3.5 million from left of center, grant makers and philanthropic organizations. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, a nonprofit that's managed by Arabella Advisors, which has been in the news a lot recently. It's a sort of a for-profit consultancy that is effectively running a bunch of subsidiary nonprofits effectively that overwhelmingly favor sort of left and center causes and organizations. So that's the deal with American Rivers. And again, these guys are pushing for dam removal, not just in the Klamath, but all over the United States. And then you mentioned the Klamath, the KRRC, which is the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. So that's a nonprofit entity effectively that was created. There's some groups like American Rivers that are involved with it. There are state agencies that are involved with it. Also some tribal entities, I believe. So that's the entity that's sort of in charge of overseeing this whole process of getting rid of the dams and restoring the river to this free flowing state that they would like. I'm not a fly fisher. I'm sure you would be able to catch plenty more fish than me, but this is something that they're advocating for big time. And I to an extent I understand it. And in fact, these folks may even know more about rivers and ecosystems than I do. But I do think it's interesting that you have organizations that are pushing for one thing with the stated aim of helping the salmon or the ecosystem or what have you, and ultimately for one reason or another you get results that are entirely contrary, at least on a one-off basis here, to that stated goal. So yeah, that's the relationship there. And in my conversation with the congressman about this, he's been an opponent of dam removal for many years now. He's been on this issue, and the way he likened it to me is that for some of these environmentalist groups that are pushing hard for dam removal, they sort of consider every dam that they are able to get rid of as a trophy of sorts, if you will. That's sort of their goal, and in many cases, at least as he described it to me, in so many words, sometimes if the planning isn't there or the results are a little bit more mixed than people would like, that can take a back seat to the fact that, well, we got rid of the dam and we got what we wanted. So let's hang our hat on that and move on to the next target, if you will.
That's what a lot of these preservationist environmentalists are fine with. I see this echoed a lot in construction or consideration for utility scale solar and wind and even offshore wind. They ignore potential consequences to these projects. Let's say the killing of certain marine life, as we're witnessing. There is a connection. It's starting to be made with offshore wind and potential deleterious consequences on wildlife. They don't care as long as it fits the net zero agenda. I have been researching some other dam removal projects or endeavors that a lot of these environmentalists are wanting to take. I'm specifically referring to the lower Snake River dams, 4 dams in particular. I'm going to be going to investigate this, as I told you before we started recording. And I heard that they want to remove the dam. They say it's good for the salmon. And hydroelectric power, for people who don't know, it's actually pretty reliable. It does take up some land. But once it's there, it's very stable. You have it 24/7. And for the most part, it's worked. I mean, there's Bonneville Dam. I'm going to be visiting that. It's an active hatchery, but also an Army Corps of Engineer dam. And they haven't reported any problems, to my knowledge, of that. And so what are they hoping to replace? If you've done some research into this, Nick, what do they hope to replace the hydropower with? Like solar and wind? Because that is what I'm told, if you were to successfully remove and breach the dams in the lower Snake River, which are going to be more difficult to remove because that would take congressional approval. So it won't be so immediate, much like it is in Klamath. But what do they hope to replace that reliable source of energy with? Obviously, you were saying and alluding to trade-offs. They're not factoring in the trade-offs that would happen when you remove this reliable baseload power and replace it with something far less reliable and environmentally friendly, but it just checks off a box, or like you said, puts forth the stated goal of claiming a trophy. So what do they hope to replace these dams with in the Klamath?
Yeah, so I'm happy you brought this up because in my opinion, which, I'm a reporter, I'm not an opinion guy, but in my view, personally, I think this issue of, the shifting power grid is perhaps maybe the most important, one of the most, at least, important kind of economic and societal issues that we're going to have to deal with here in the next 2 decades, especially. So, and this goes far beyond the Klamath River. This is a national discussion. And, of course, there's plenty of state policy and even the local and municipal policy that feeds into this. But the general idea that we're getting from particularly, Democrats and a lot of the environmentalist base is that, we are going to retire and replace reliable, relatively inexpensive generation capacity, whether that's hydroelectric, whether that's gas plants. Coal plants are in fewer numbers these days, but they still exist, especially as peaker plants and sort of this safety reserve, I guess you can call them, to put it in layman's terms. But the idea is that we're going to get rid of those tried and true, and even actually sort of older, aging nuclear facilities. We're going to decommission those in some places, and we're going to replace all of that capacity that powers not only the American economy, but energy is the ultimate resource. You turn on the lights, you're able to go to a hospital, God forbid you need to, and everything goes smoothly. It really does touch everything. But in any event, we're going to replace that capacity with what's currently intermittent and generally not cost competitive, especially when you strip away subsidies, green energy generation such as solar and wind. And it's a little more complicated than that, but you have policy from all sorts of different federal agencies that are pushing this idea. First and foremost, the EPA. And so that's sort of the idea here, is that we're getting rid of what's currently working, and we're going to try to subsidize and regulate intermittent and not exactly cost competitive renewable generation to offset that capacity. But there are a lot of issues with this strategy, at least as things stand right now. First and foremost is that solar and wind, the wind isn't always blowing and the sun is not always shining. So the idea is that we're going to take, we're going to charge up solar cells and get all this wind to come in, and we're going to store that power that's generated in batteries. So that way, when the sun goes down and, we still need to meet demand to keep the lights on, those batteries will have stored up energy during the day, which can then be, dispatched to meet that demand. So that's the general idea. And all of this is in pursuit of, steep emissions cuts in the American economy over the coming decades to fight climate change. And mind you, China, it's an oft-cited study, but I believe it was in 2022, the Chinese government permitted 2 new coal plants every week on average. So, and I'm sure it comes as no shock to your listeners that China does not exactly have, the stringent ecological regulatory regime that we have here in the United States. In any event, that's the general strategy. And this is a huge, kind of pet issue and priority for the Biden administration. The EPA is currently in the process of rolling out effectively a Clean Power Plan 2.0, if you will, in reference to the Obama years. And the idea is that, we're going to give natural gas and coal plants they can stay online, but they're going to need to adopt and implement, for example, hydrogen blending or carbon capture and sequestration technology. And currently those technologies are, number one, not really demonstrated to be effective at scale. And number two, they're also extremely expensive as things stand. So generally speaking, there are going to be plenty of plant operators that just decide to shut down, natural gas or coal plants, rather than deal with the arduous permitting process or eat those extra costs, because it just doesn't make sense for them to do that. And the sum total of all of this stuff is that in the future, you have serious potential for grid reliability and adequacy issues, which is fancy talk for blackouts if things do not go well. This is something that grid officials and sort of power grid wonks have been raising the alarm about. It doesn't get a ton of media attention because it's very wonky and technical stuff, but it's extremely important. So that's sort of the background of this. And, I think a solution that people talk about sometimes is nuclear energy, but it's important to understand that the regulatory regime for nuclear power is so overwhelming that in many cases it doesn't really make sense for investors to want to pour money into new nuclear plants because they just won't really see great return, or if they do, it won't be for a very long time. So the sum total of this is that you have potential adequacy issues down the road, and you also have potential cost issues, especially as the Biden administration and elements of the sort of environmental left are pushing very hard for electric vehicles, electric trucks, decarbonized buildings. We have enormous chips manufacturing facilities that are supposed to come online, data centers. These things all take an enormous amount of electricity and power to actually make it all work. So on the one hand, we're seemingly setting ourselves up for some supply issues while also massively increasing demand over the next couple decades. So that's energy, like all other things, is a supply and demand commodity, and that combination is definitely troubling to some people. And I do think that some folks in DC and beyond are starting to identify this problem, but it seems like it's all very far away, but these are complicated systems that take years of planning, and decisions for years from now need to be made today. So, it's a crucial issue for the country overall. And I think it's one that deserves more attention than it gets, generally speaking.
You're not wrong, because even E&E News, which is very favorable, they're great reporters. I like reading them, but they do have a bias somewhat in favor of carbon neutrality or achieving net zero goals. But they were even recently conceding that low carbon shift risks blackouts, grid reliability, and they have a whole expose on this. So if you're having them even sounding the alarm on this and saying that we may not have the capacity to do this, maybe we need to take a step back when all these other utility operators are starting to sound the alarm there. Nick, if my listeners want to learn more from this Klamath River report or your other musings and writings at Daily Caller, where would you like to send everyone to, please?
Sure. So in terms of my stuff, I'll take the bait. I'll promote myself. The best place to find me, first on the internet, you can just look up Nick Pope, Daily Caller News Foundation. I write about all measure of energy and environmental topics, and also some more kind of traditional political news. I'm on Twitter at Real Nick Pope. I should say X. My apologies. And one thing I will say is even this Klamath River story was sort of ignored, such that I'm a guy who gets paid to sort of look for these types of stories, and it even slipped under my radar. So really, what sort of put me onto it was just looking around, and I found some excellent local reporting on this specific issue. And it's something that I think I'll be keeping an eye on for sure. And I encourage people not only to, of course, read my content, but insofar as there's really solid and well done local reporting on these types of issues, I encourage people to look into it for themselves and find facts for themselves and come to their own opinion. I think that is, number one, just a good way to sort of navigate this information age, but also it's an excellent way to find things and facts that are either inconvenient to national narratives or for one reason or another kind of get brushed over.
Wonderful. No, you have excellent writings and musings. I always try to glance and see what you're up to, much like everyone else kind of in our little group of center-right conservative leaning energy beat reporters and writers, because we're a small but mighty bunch, and it's always good to support one another. So anytime I can amplify your stuff, I like to, and that's why I brought you on the program, because I thought this was really timely and interesting, not because of my upcoming report, but I think this issue has been slipping under the radar. And you're right, it does address a lot of stuff about energy trade-offs. Do you remove something that's stable for this pursuit of the perfect, even though the perfect could actually turn out worse than what we currently have now? A lot of people are waking up to this reality that maybe we're better off having existing infrastructure for untested or unreliable, compared to, going swiftly and hastily towards untested, unproven, and kind of environmentally questionable and hypocritical sources that would actually enact even more environmental harm and not lower your utility bill whatsoever. And so, Nick, we really appreciate you coming on District of Conservation. Come back anytime you have an interesting report like this, and I'll encourage everyone to follow your work. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and wish you all the best when you head out to the Snake River to check this out.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.